more love, more joy, everything.
It's inspired young people.
Inspiration comes from within you. When you clear out the garbage that's in your mind, you then create space for something better, more beautiful to come in.
Let's have life and have it more abundantly.
I say yes.
It's like taking a workshop. I get to be in my pajamas.
We have a very active imagination, which is why it's important to learn how to harness it and then point it in the direction you want to go.
I listen to your show every day.
It's time now for Living Your Inspired Life with Susan Burrell. Susan is no-nonsense, inspirational, motivational, and fun.
This is positive talk radio.
Practical wisdom for everyday life.
It's a gift you give yourself.
Now, here's Susan.
And welcome to Living Your Inspired Life. You're listening to News Talk 1590 KVTA. And on Living Your Inspired Life, every week we try and bring you something that's uplifting, possibly thought-provoking, maybe even life-changing. And if you miss anything of our show today, we always have the shows on our website, livingyourinspiredlife.org. And you can go to the website and tune in and tune up and get caught up on the conversation that we've been having. So with that said, today we're going to be talking about radical forgiveness and grief recovery. And I have two people that are joining me today. Tom Spence of the morning show KVTA.
Good to be here.
Thank you, Tom.
My pleasure.
And Tom is also my sound engineer, for which I'm eternally grateful. And then also joining us is a woman that we had a conversation in January, Leslie Neale. Leslie, thanks so much for coming back on.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks, Susan.
And I got to tell everybody, Leslie is a documentary filmmaker, and she does documentaries about radical forgiveness and social justice. So the website for everybody to check you out, Leslie, is?
Unlikelyfriendsforgive.com.
Okay. So I'm grateful that when I called you a couple days ago, you picked up the phone, because I was really trying to sort for myself and wrap my mind around the shootings that occurred in Isla Vista last week. Yeah. And the 6 college students who were murdered, along with the shooter who ended himself. And I realized that in the county, it's just sending out waves of grief, which brings in all the components of grief, of the anger or the denial or the blaming or the sadness. And I just want us to address that today, because I think that there's people out there that even if they didn't know someone, if they weren't directly touched, I think everybody is feeling it. It's just kind of rocking our world.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Yeah. So the other thing I just want everybody to know, if you haven't heard, that the great poet Maya Angelou made her transition a couple days ago. And so I did find a couple of quotes from her that are just very profound and deep and sweet, that I'm just going to share with everybody today as we talk about radical forgiveness and grief recovery. So Leslie, why don't you share with our listeners what your experience in doing your documentaries like Unlikely Friends, what it is that you learned. And you shared with me the other day that there's several stories that didn't end up in the footage of your films that were just heart-opening.
Well, first of all, I just want to, share from deep within my heart my sadness for this latest tragedy, and my condolences to all the family members of all the victims, as well as the shooter's family. And I'm sorry that as a society we are here again.
Yeah, yet again.
Yeah, yet again. And so, of course, it's going to touch all of our psyches and our spirits, because we are a community, and what affects one person affects us all. We're all so connected, and
well, and I think that's why the parent of Christopher Martinez, Richard, has become so vocal immediately And, you know, his grief is fueled from anger and about, you know, how someone could get a hold of weapons so readily and then use them against other people, which is going to be a longer conversation we'll have on living your inspired life. But it's interesting to see how different people deal with their grief. And certainly Christopher's father is in that place of anger, which I think many of us feel about all of that.
Well, I think, you know, as I certainly saw in making my film and making the walk with several of the people whose stories I tell in Unlikely Friends, is that it's pretty rare that any of us choose forgiveness off the bat. It's usually a choice that comes out of years of anguish and pain as a remedy that alleviates that anguish and suffering. So I see that Christopher's father is right on track. I mean, you know, anger, you know, Gail Sheehy wrote about, you know, passages many years ago. I mean, there's stages of grief. And, you know, one can be, and maybe should be suspect, if somebody immediately can go to that place of forgiveness. And, you know, denial, rage, anger, sadness, depression can be all stages of grief. And certainly the subjects that I worked with and the stories that I tell in Unlikely Friends, most of them did not stumble upon forgiveness right off the bat. There is one story where he came to it pretty readily in a meditation, suffering from his grief. But most people, I tell two stories, for example, they wanted the death penalty.
Well, Leslie, hold on. Let's back up because I'm realizing people may not have heard our conversation last January. So your documentaries are based on, I forget how you call them, not survivors or victims, and the perpetrator that's done something against these people, and often it's a violent crime.
Right. The stories I tell are victims of violent crime, many who have lost their children or only children, or they've been significantly maimed themselves. And they not only forgive their perpetrator, and most of them over time or through time, but they actually become friends with them. So I tell several stories in that film, Unlikely Friends. And again, the website's unlikelyfriendsforgive.com if anybody wants more information. But what I discovered is pretty significantly is that, like I was just about to say, that anger and rage is the common state after something that is so unexplainable occurs. Something so horrific. What happens is when we get stuck in that anger and rage, that it becomes very debilitating over time. In the film, we have Fred Luskin, who is a forgiveness expert out of Stanford University, talking about actually the brain rewires itself when we're constantly, choosing the choice to be angry and to be rageful.
Okay, the brain rewires itself into rage, constant rage?
No, that we create neural pathways when we stay in a certain emotional state, that the brain is wired for all kinds of states: anger, love, compassion, forgiveness, rage, revenge. But when we continually stay in anger and revenge, we're creating the neural pathways that bypass the other states.
So it makes it harder.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so it makes it harder then for people, if they're constantly wired into rage, then it must make it harder for them to experience happiness or love or...
Perhaps what they're finding in brain research is that actually affects creative thinking.
Oh.
So not in terms of how to be creative, but how to think, how to problem solve.
I see.
So there's and the studies are just now becoming. The studies are just now coming out on forgiveness and the effect on the brain. But that it can have there's a reason those who forgive are finding relief.
Okay.
So there can be a real physical and psychological benefit to that choice, but it doesn't necessarily. It's not the first choice. It's very rare that it's the first choice, and so perhaps we need to move through all these different stages before we can arrive on forgiveness. And some victims, they're never going to make that choice. And that should be their right, and I think it's very important to state that. I think it's almost insulting to tell a victim of any type of tragedy to say let it go.
Oh God,
move
yes.
on.
Oh yeah. That's the hardest thing. I had somebody tell me that this weekend regarding a personal matter I'm going through. I wanted to just slap her.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So it's really a personal journey, a personal choice. What we're saying in the film, or what I said, the purpose of the film was to show that the people who are choosing forgiveness and are finding great relief and freedom in it, they have a right to that as well. And they have a right to talk about that without being judged by society as being some kind of, psychological aberration to them.
Right. It's interesting because in prepping for today in our conversation, Leslie, I was seeing that the parents of one of Elliot Rodgers' roommates made a comment at the UCSB memorial they held, and it was read. They said, "May we together create a peaceful world and let hatred be gone with the wind." Now, that's lovely. I think that's lovely. And how they could arrive at that so quickly, like you're talking about, is I couldn't do it. Tom, what about you? Could you say, okay, let me just forgive right now and let my hatred go?
Very difficult.
I know you're a Scot.
Yeah, and I hang on to things. I think one of the issues, the other problem is being what I was told I was a reductionist. I think I have to find the cause of everything.
Yeah.
And I'll search for that forever. Why did this happen? And you go nuts doing that. And trying to explain everything rather than understanding that principle of let it go. Everything has to be explained. Why did you do this? Where did it happen? Why did it happen?
How can we make sure it doesn't happen again?
Exactly.
Right.
And you get so caught up in how do I get revenge? It could spin you for the rest of your life.
Well, and clearly that's what happened to Elliot Rodger.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was spinning him, his need for vengeance and revenge that ended in tragedy. So, Leslie, share one of the stories you were saying about this man who was set for the death penalty.
Right. Well, since the community of Santa Barbara right now is grieving so much because they lost children mostly, I'll share the story of Debbie, who lost her only son to a drive-by shooting. And she literally went on the streets looking for who it might be.
Mm.
And she says in the film, I don't know what I would have done had I found him, but if I had a gun in my hand, I know I would have killed him.
Oh, yeah. I think most parents feel that way.
Yeah, right? And she wanted the death penalty, and it was a death penalty case. It ended up at the end not being, going to the death penalty. And in Arizona, where the story took place, they do not have life for murder. And so her son's killer will be coming out after serving about 20 years. And she, ended up, after about 3 years of being full of rage, full of anguish, full of pain, wanting the death penalty, wanting to kill him herself, had a spiritual awakening. She was a Christian, and she said, God forgave, them killing his son. I have to do the same. So she reached out to him, and over time, didn't happen immediately, but through dialogue, letters and exchanges and phone calls and eventually meeting him in prison, they're very, very close. They consider each other good friends. In fact, when I went in to meet them both, and I heard Gabriel, as we were leaving the prison, Gabriel and Debbie hugged. Now, he killed her only son brutally on the street, didn't even know him, just shot him down, just random. He was a good kid walking home one night. And here I see Gabriel, her son's killer, they're hugging each other, and they tell each other that they love one another. I was blown away. I mean, astounded.
Yeah, I bet.
And so I know that it's possible. I don't know. Now, you and Tom were just talking about, well, I couldn't do it. I don't know that I could do it. I know now because I've made this film. I know it's possible.
It's possible, right?
It's possible. And people, and you're asking me about, some of the stories that didn't make it into the film, and for a variety of reasons. I was talking to this one woman, and she was telling me the vicious murder of her daughter, stabbed 17 times, and by a stranger. And I said, and she was, I believe, 18 years old. And I said, I could not forgive this. And she said, oh, yes, you could. And I said, no, I really don't think I could. And she said, oh, yes, you could, because you'd have to. And I got chills running through my body because I knew what she was telling me, not because it was a should, to be a good Christian or to be a good
person
Muslim or whatever. It was, you'd have to, because you would be in so much pain.
So that sounds like the breaking point or the tipping point of someone's grief.
Yeah.
So forgiveness is the result of that, coming against that edge where you just cannot do that anymore.
Well, I think we're all talking about gun control now, and which certainly we need to talk about and change, in my opinion. I don't know that it would necessarily stop, somebody who's intent, but I think the fact that we can buy so much ammunition and whatnot it's over the line. And we're also talking about mental health, which, I've researched that. I was thinking about doing a film on an aspect of it at one point. So spent some time with the National Mental Health Association, and, we need so many changes and reforms. So it's great that we're all talking about it and we're getting the dialogue, but I think what we're trying to do as a collective consciousness is that we're trying to control. Like you said, so it'll never happen again. So it won't happen. Well, I just think it's our need to try and fix and control and make sense out of something that can't be made sense of. It can't be controlled. Hopefully we can mitigate it. We can make it harder. We can bring more awareness so that we all becoming our brother's keepers, and watch and help one another. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of our problems lie in spiritual answers.
Well, I would agree with you on that, and that, or at least conscious awareness, and that something does have to change. Tom, did you want to chime in here?
Yeah, this is
Tom's been nodding his head.
This is the perfect horrific crime because it started off with 3 stabbings to death.
Yeah.
So then you have that issue. So it comes up with we'll figure out the cure and what we do, but it's definitely it's got to come from, in my opinion, it's got to come from taking care of people way better than we do right now.
Right.
Way better than we do. We're so callous. Look at that freak on the corner. Look at that kid who's got the issue. And there's a lot of us who do it to a very, very teeny degree, and then there's some people who hammer it hard. And it's so difficult. You talk about the biblical issues here that some people go to, since I'm not as biblical as many people out there. The one flip that shocked me is when I read the book, We Were Soldiers Once.
Yeah.
And you read about this. The guys in Vietnam, they met our Marines, met the Viet Cong, and they had a conversation. Can you imagine that level of forgiveness? Yeah. And that was the first time when I read that, I thought, to me, that is so real. And these guys sat down, had a conversation that involved respect, that involved understanding.
Didn't they go back to
They did.
Vietnam?
They
And
went back
and these
and-
are the guys that had done the thing they were asked to do.
Toe-to-toe murder of each
My
other is
God
what
bless.
it amounted to. And you saw that they had a level of forgiveness. When I read that, I thought, okay, maybe I can forgive that girl that broke my heart back in the 8th grade. And I'm not being silly there.
No,
I'm
I
just
get
saying
it.
the grudge I will carry, you look at that and you say, okay, what's the point?
Right. And it just all will add up until, like you're saying, Leslie, you just have to lay it down. I want to read something that I found of Maya Angelou, and it's about forgiveness. She says, you can't forgive without loving. And I don't mean sentimentally. I don't mean mush. I mean having both courage to stand up and say, I forgive, and I'm finished with it. Having the courage to stand up and say, I forgive and I'm finished with it, and do it from a place of heart-centered love. I just, wow, I don't know. I don't know.
Well, another story in the film, Rada from San Francisco, again, her only son, who was viciously murdered by a school roommate. And everybody in the film, I asked them, well, define what forgiveness is for you. And she was the one who said, I think it's just a letting go. It's not a condoning of what they did. It's not trying to find reasons for what they did. It's just letting it go.
Okay, but I mean, like what you said, Tom, there is a place where humanity, we have to sort through the basket of all the garbage to go, okay, if not that, then this, and if not that, then this, until that whole thing is empty and you go, all right, then I can let it go. It must be like that. I don't know. I mean, certainly in my small experience, I think what we're all collectively experiencing is a bigger awareness, especially since of all these shootings and then, the dynamics, the stuff that's happening around the world. I think we are not only experiencing our own losses, big or small, but we're also realizing that we're connected in this web or matrix, as Greg Braden says, that divine matrix. We're so connected that even my small grief gets amplified because there's so many other people in grief or in sorrow or in anger because they've lost something big or small. And that affects our collective consciousness. So then so let's riff on this for a minute, if you guys will. So if we can become more aware as a group, let's say, or a community, that the process of grief looks like the stages of anger and blame and all of that, but it also at some point has to end, or like you said, Leslie, doesn't have to, but in the ideal utopia Susan Burrell is building in her Living Your Inspired Life brain. But if we can all get to that place of forgiveness to some degree, then perhaps the prior consciousness that was that place of vengeance, that place of anger, might begin to rewire itself, like you were talking about, Leslie, in the neurosynapse places of the brain.
Exactly. I mean, it's interesting why simultaneously or parallel as we're making such advances in terms of looking at the brain. I mean, we're able to look at the brain now in ways that we weren't able to do 25 years ago. And there's so many more studies on looking at compassion and now forgiveness on the brain. Simultaneously, we're being asked in our society to deal with these absolutely horrific, unexplainable, unforgivable events. I mean, it's happening more and more. So I don't know what that means in terms of collective consciousness and evolution and where we're evolving to, but it's interesting that it's happening simultaneously.
Yeah, I have another quote from Maya Angelou. I got to tell you, what an amazing woman. She said, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." Now, isn't that true? Which is what you were talking about, Tom, of everything that's up now, and Leslie, you were saying this too, we are at a place where we really need to be aware of what is it we need to change, how can we change it, and change it in a way that is, at least in my, again, my utopian world, that would really be of service to everyone, not just the particular political or opinionated groups, but to everyone. And that means not reliving it over and over and over again. Hello? We've been having a lot of that going on in the last, well, I don't know what, years.
Yeah, forever it seems like. And it's the other thing about the experiences of having a conversation like this show, or whether you go to college, whether you have that. But I was forced to read Now I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. I hope I didn't screw up the title. I was forced to read it, and I thought, one of the greatest books I ever read.
Who's it by? I remember.
Maya.
Oh,
that's
right. That's why it sounded familiar.
That's her book. And I remember when they said, you've got to read this book, I thought, why are you doing this to me? Mm-hmm. Why do you hate me so much? I read the book, and it's like, whoa, a light goes on. And it seems like a cliche now, but they're all the great books. Viktor Frankl. Uh-huh. I was forced to read that. And you read and you see his experience. And as you go through everything other people, like your film, and learning about what people have done, not that it's one of those, see how bad he had it, you should be happy. Instead of looking at it that way, what I learned is I'm not the only one. And look at the methods and the way these people went through it. Perhaps I could apply that to how I should go through it. Not like them, but sort of
kind of opened a door,
exactly.
or something.
Like a path, like whatever that is. And you see it and you go, certainly these aren't diagrams, but they are ways people went through it. And I think that in the conversation is really important.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. And that, Leslie, that's what you bring to the table, is giving people an insightful view into the possibility of finding forgiveness in horrific experiences.
Yeah, and once again, I mean, I don't know that I could do it. I do believe that the people that I was, had the good fortune and privilege to tell their stories, I believe that they're leaders, they're teachers for us. They're showing us what's possible. Of course, all of the great spiritual teachers from time have all pointed towards forgiveness. But it's an interesting thing when you bring it into the everyday culture. It's considered incredibly controversial, and that, well, it's okay to forgive, a small thing. It's not okay to forgive a big thing.
Wow.
And it's impossible. And so why is that in us? And what is that in us that has, that need or that habit to hang on, to a very debilitating emotion.
Oh, as you're saying that, what I'm getting, at least from my experience of working with clients, is that oftentimes it almost becomes, it is the defining moment in people's lives when you experience something as awful as that. And like Elliot Rodgers, his parents, oh my goodness, those poor people are completely shattered and will never, ever recover any kind of semblance of life that they had prior to that. And I think it becomes our defining piece, but then those of us that are unable to move into forgiveness, I think then it becomes, that's where you live. It's almost like you get rooted in that one instance. I'm not diminishing this by any way, people. That's not what I'm saying. But just in my effort to try and understand it, is that we get rooted into that. I don't know. Maybe I would get rooted into that. And then my life, it becomes impossible for me to experience anything better or new or wholesome, if you would, because I'm grounded in that place of anger and rage and unforgiveness. So I can see where the forgiveness piece can at least help you put it into a different compartment in your life, so that whatever you have to live after that, you can. Am I making sense here, Tom?
Well, it's and everything is so based and steeped in revenge. I mean, in
Yeah.
movies we
Oh,
like. I'm a
constant.
huge fan of Braveheart. I'm a Scot. So you see that, and I must go out and just take care of everyone who did that to me.
Right.
And you get on these just rampage, determined to do that because you have to take them out. And we're in that mindset, and it's crazy because when you look at it, the other thing is people can say what they want forever, and people, my wife went through breast cancer, and one of the things that can drive you nuts, and I know this because my wife went through it, is when it hasn't happened to somebody else and somebody who has never had the issue in their life comes up to you and gives you advice.
Oh, boy.
that can be tough on somebody, and they can say, "Oh, you just have to think positively." You just go ahead and you think. It plays so deeply. Why me? Why this? Why that? And like you said with this kid's parents, they did try to act on it.
Right,
apparently.
they did try.
They really. So now they have to find a way to forgive themselves for doing
For maybe having done all they could and you
Not
know,
enough,
I would have
clearly.
that thought, oh my God, it wasn't enough. What else could I have done? And yet they did everything.
Yeah, apparently they did. And,
Yeah.
And so that's the path we have to go on. When I parachuted twice, and this might sound a little out there, but
I
here's
didn't know this.
one. I jumped out of a plane twice, and one thing a jump master said to me, they said, "You have never parachuted until you've had a failure, because you jump out, shoot works, jump out, shoot works, jump out, shoot works, jump out, shoot doesn't work. That's when you become a parachutist, because that's when you have to react to the situation. It's the same thing for us in these terrible situations. Until it's happened directly to you, it's so hard for us to relate. And I think that comes up a lot.
Yeah.
That's right.
So we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, I want to talk about the grief recovery part of this place of radical forgiveness. So I'm having the conversation with Tom Spence and Leslie Neale of Chance Films. And we're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back.
Hi, this is Susan Burrell from Living Your Inspired Life. I always find it easier and more fun to expand my life by being connected to open-hearted, like-minded people committed to being on the same path I am. If you feel the same way, I suggest you visit a Center for Spiritual Living. There are wonderful communities in Ventura, Ojai, Santa Barbara, Oxnard, Pleasant Valley, Camarillo, and Westlake Village. You'll find terrific people, great information, and more tools to help you live the life you were born to live. So go to csl.org to find a center near you. That's csl.org for a center near you.
And welcome back to Living Your Inspired Life. You're listening to News Talk 1590 KVTA. I'm Susan Burrell. And if you've missed anything, go to livingyourinspiredlife.org to get caught up. And while you're there, please visit our donations page, and you can give a one-time gift to maintain us on the air, or you can even give a monthly gift that will help us bring positive talk radio to the airwaves. So once again, in studio with me is Tom Spence, and calling in from LA is Leslie Neale, and we are talking about radical forgiveness today and grief recovery in the aftermath of the shootings in Isla Vista last week. So Leslie, coming back into this conversation, you wanted to say one more thing about forgiveness.
Well, I just think it's important to understand that forgiveness is really from the victim's perspective. And so I think Tom was talking about, things that were appropriate to say or inappropriate to say when his wife was dealing with breast cancer. I think it's the same thing for forgiveness. It's really not to tell a victim that they need to or that they should forgive, because it's a personal choice, and there's many victims out here who will do just fine in life without forgiving.
Right.
It really is. It's that many victims though do find that choice of forgiveness frees them more than anything else has. And I think that's what we're talking, in that it is a choice that one can take, but it's not necessarily the mandated choice.
Right. I think that it does bring relief, but at the same time, it's got to be hecka hard.
It's difficult, and I'll just go back to that situation with my wife. What I've learned, doing the walk with Relay for Life and all of that, and going through this, how can I help? That's
a great
always the best thing
question.
to do to them if you say, how can I help? And people, I'll tell you, whether it's cooking a meal, whether it's running. And so it just as a quick, I know it's a little off topic on that, but
No,
when
that's good.
you're looking to, and with somebody in grief, be there for you.
Yeah.
How can I help? Be there for you rather than being Dr. Cure because I'm your happy friend.
Right.
That can be a problem. And I did that in the old days. I ran when
Oh,
I got
everybody.
broke up, and they look and say, well,
Everybody
thank you
has.
very much for that.
Yeah.
So we're all learning as we go.
Yeah. So I want to direct people to a website. It's called griefrecoverymethod.com. And these guys have done grief recovery work for a few decades now. And they've written a book called The Grief Recovery Handbook, which I have used. I've done my own grief work out of that book. Is so helpful. And one of the things they say is when you're talking to somebody who's in grief, you don't say, I know how you feel.
Yeah, right.
Because that robs the individual of their experience of grief and all that they need to go through in that grief. And also then to say, how can I help? Or just to say, instead of saying, I understand how you feel, to say, wow, I cannot imagine what you're going through. Tell me more. Because in general, as a society, we avoid people who are in grief. It's like, oh, wow, they're really sad. They're really upset. And I'm just going to give them space so they can heal. And really, that's not for the people in grief. That's more for us, man, because I don't want to step in their doo-doo or experience their emotions, right? So
we don't know what to do. We're afraid of it.
Oh, we're absolutely afraid of it.
Because we're going to have to confront ourselves about our own fears and our own mortality and our, demise. And I think that a big situation like this Santa Barbara shooting is we're all having to do that as well. And I think another grieving piece that collectively we're going through is that our society has gotten to this state.
Wait,
That Tom was talking about earlier, that we're not taking care of one another, and that we need to do a better job of that. But I think when we turn on the news and we see that this has happened, our hearts sink, and that's what society has become.
Well, and it does tend to make you feel a little helpless. Like, okay, there's nothing I can do. I was having breakfast the morning after with two of my close friends who's all of our kids are now going to SBCC, up there in Isla Vista. And on the one hand, one of my friends was in tears saying, I would do anything to ensure that my children are safe. I would gladly die for them. And then the other side, we're going, and yet you can't be there. Every individual, we are all now living our lives and to live it from a place of fear or feeling helpless because these things happen is as debilitating as living from a place of rage or revenge.
Right, which in a if we can pull back and get it from a larger perspective, I think in seeing that we aren't in control, and I also have college-age students, and of course it's one of the fears that we have, and that you would do anything, but yet you can't. You have to let them live their own lives.
Yeah.
And you can't protect them. And yet, when you continue to step back, at least for me, the steps always lead to the only power you do have is the power to love.
Oh, I love that.
And so to continue love, and in a way, that's I think where that coincides right there with forgiveness. So as a society, as we can, we try and control, we try and manage what happened, what can this do, why did this boy end up this way, to do this and take this lives. When it's interesting, that's what he was writing about in his manifesto. That
Right.
he didn't have love, that he wanted love.
Right.
And so I just think there are interesting correlations that I think ultimately that's where we're headed, is that our ills, our imbalances, not to trivialize, not to dumb it down, quite the contrary. But the answer is going to be in love.
I totally agree with you, Leslie. And it's interesting because I think for me, having gone through grief episodes for different things in my life, the place where somebody can just be present with me with a loving heart and a listening ear is that place of sanctuary when, at least for me, when I'm in grief. Then I know there's somebody that I can just talk to until I'm done grieving, and not with any judgment over there on how I'm grieving, why I'm grieving. Tom, you were saying on break about sitting Shiva.
Yeah, and that's with my Jewish friends. The first time I heard of that is a really good friend of mine. His mother died, and he was saying this is what they do, and I thought it was a remarkable process. But then there's an issue with that is it's like a week, 7 days,
right?
And you cover the mirrors, don't wear makeup, don't do anything that's frivolous or like entertaining, and you sit in that. Well, if you have that in your heart, that when you know it's done, it is released. That's remarkable. And at least it is a process, but putting a shot clock on it, if you will, like in exactly 7 days you will feel this way. I don't know what that is.
Right. So does that actually tamp down the grief as opposed to releasing it?
Or is the practice of their faith their entire life, let them go into that so it then works. Just like if you study karate and you're in a kata, when you finally get in a fight, you'll know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Does that practice?
Mm-hmm.
I think it also provides a container.
Sure.
And, within the container, within structure, there's a tremendous amount of freedom and movement. And to me, that's what we're lacking a lot in our culture.
A container and structure?
Yeah, a container and structure for the shadow side of our culture, if you will. I could say for, grief, but it's so much larger than that.
Right,
we don't want to look at it. So you were talking earlier about how, we see a homeless person on the street, or, we don't really want to deal with that, or somebody's going through a grieving process and we tend to kind of stay away or whatever. It's because I think we don't have a container of which to really operate. And we're lost. And we need to find those containers back, those structures, to be able to come back and really learn how to take care of ourselves. And I don't know what the answer is. The family of this boy, certainly tried. It seems. He had therapists and whatnot.
Yes, Elliot.
But he was not feeling invited into the larger culture.
No. And
due to mental illness.
Right. There's that, too. So, this really is so fascinating to me because it has all the components and all the, I want to say, flags or symbols of things that we as a culture and a community and humanity can work on to move into a different way of being in life. And on Living Your Inspired Life, Leslie, we've been talking about what's the new normal. What is the next experience as a human family for us? And we don't have those containers in place. We don't have, because our old paradigms are falling away. This whole idea of the warrior archetype is really, we're seeing how it's more devastating than it is affirming and positive. And it's almost like that archetype is just finally...
not working anymore.
It's not working anymore. And this is not, again, people, this is not to trash those that have fallen in service of our country or those that are currently working for American freedom. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is what you were saying, Leslie, that there is a larger container we need to develop as a culture so that, again, though the people that are being disenfranchised or whatever, feeling that way, can be brought into the larger collective and cared for some way. Tom, earlier you were talking about the people returning back from Vietnam or Iraq and being kind of, okay, great, thanks a lot, see you later.
Hey, Game of Thrones is on, let's hang.
Right.
And they have to decompress. They have to go through their process. And that's the question that we don't know. So that's when they come back from the war. Mm-hmm. And for people who came back and been back, like the Vietnam veterans, we just have to say, what can we do for you? What can I do for you is one of my favorite questions. Another sermon that I actually had the pleasure of sitting through once, they were talking to all of us in this church we were in, and he said, here's the deal. You hear somebody come in late to church, and you turn around, it's Sting. And you're sitting there going, oh, please sit next to me. Please, it would be great. Flash forward. The door opens, you look over, this smelly homeless guy walked in, and you're saying, for the love of God, sit somewhere else. And he said, how many of you are thinking that right now? And I think it's an unfortunate part of our psyche, but the people who we think are crazy or these people, I'll say, we don't know how to deal with them, so then we don't want to.
Right.
But the shiny, happy people we want to be with.
So they're attractive and the other ones aren't.
I love the whole conversation of a container is perfect. If we learned how to deal with the people that make us uncomfortable, we would have that capacity when it occurs. And I like that. Now I am going to think in containers. I think that's a great way to put it.
Large containers, Tom.
That's right. They've got to be humongous because I'm only me. But there are all of these problems because a lot of us look at this kid, that little, and we rather than if we would have done something beforehand, maybe that would have been the difference.
Right. And that's the proactive conversation to have. What could we as a culture done, and what could we do to support his parents in supporting him, that kind of stuff, and to make the awareness larger. I am also noticing already. It's been a week, and people are already going, okay, that was just a random act. That's not going to happen again. Oh, thank God that happened up in Isla Vista and didn't happen in Cucamonga, or what, we're already compartmentalizing it going, okay, well, so I don't have to give that any more energy because it was just a weirdo thing. And that's not true.
Right.
It's happening so frequently that we need to develop better skill sets or new skill sets on how to deal with this. And it's very interesting to me too, Leslie. It's the young. I've had several conversations with young adults, and for many of them that aren't in Santa Barbara, it's already off their radar.
Yeah. Well, I think we're tuning them out now. They're happening so frequently.
Yeah.
I mean, quite literally. I mean, the airtime isn't as much as it was. When Columbine hit, Columbine started them all. Mm-hmm. And we are becoming desensitized, and maybe out of self-protection. I mean, my God. I mean, we've got to get up and move on with our lives.
Well, and that's what Christopher's father, Richard Martinez, has been saying, is that this is beginning to seem like it's normal, and it's not, people. It's not normal.
And I think, I certainly have thought for a long time we do need to amend our gun laws. I do understand the argument, though, that probably wouldn't have done much to stop this. But I think what's becoming, from my point of view, more and more apparent is mental illness. Mm-hmm. I mean, another incident several years ago happened in Isla Vista due to mental illness, where a boy took his car and killed 4 people, had a psychotic break.
Right.
And, every single mass shooter we're seeing, there's a mental imbalance. And now we've got an example of a family that did have their kid in therapy, tried to get him on medication, called the cops. It's becoming, more visible, the holes in our society.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's the fabric has been torn.
Yeah.
And everybody's trying to just sew up the hole. Yeah. Repairing the hole, as opposed to going, wow, maybe we need to get a whole new dressmaker in here. Let's just get a different kind of fabric that's more resilient and more flexible and more forgiving and more loving.
Yeah, right. I mean, we've developed the perfect storm. I mean, who knows what's going on in the environment to have these mental illnesses on the rise. Then we've got the plethora of guns and ammunition. There's so many different variables that are coming into this mix.
And the way that we deal with things. I'm talking about law enforcement right now. Sorry, you guys aren't in my brain. You can't see my mind moving in that direction. But my heart goes out to the officers in in the Santa Barbara police force that had to deal with this, and they did, in essence, have a heads up. And yet, I'm sure they're coming under the fire because they didn't, they didn't fill in the blank, whatever. And I feel bad for those guys too. Because, are you kidding? Talk about living with this for the rest of your life. If I shoulda, coulda, woulda, if I just walked in the door, if I just opened up the door, would it all be different? Well, and I think that it might also be something to look at is how our law enforcement system operates, because, those poor guys are just trying to keep caught up, it sounds like.
Well, and then there's also the confines of, the laws. And, the laws are, do try and protect our civil liberties as well. So, it's a sticky wicket. It's tough, where we are, and we got to find our way out of it to try and, minimize this and to keep each other safe. But, boy, my heart goes out for the shooter as well, the perpetrator. Man, to be in that much pain, to feel like you're that alienated.
Right.
And that angry. It's like, wow.
And to be fantasizing and planning for 3 years.
Yeah.
With this intentionality behind it.
It's clearly, you're just not, you're sick. You're ill.
Right. And Tom, like you brought up earlier, it didn't just start with shooting. It started with vicious stabbings of his roommates. And I was thinking about that. How did people not know that was happening? How did he kill 3 people, stabbing them without anybody in the other apartments hearing it, realizing it was happening? Now, of course, it was a Friday night in a college town, so maybe there's lots of parties. I don't know. But how did people not know? And how did those men that were being attacked in that apartment not escape? Not defend, not escape. Yeah, there's so many questions that come up out of this. And there's another thing, and I am going to quote The Simpsons, because it was the most telling and, can I say, cleverest line I think I've ever heard in a sitcom. Homer goes to buy a gun. He goes into the gun store and he wants to buy a gun. And the guy says, Mr. Simpson, you have to wait 3 days. And Homer says, but I'm mad now. And I laughed and laughed and laughed, thought that was so funny. But again, the writer was very clever with this line as you look at that and all of the things, when you look at that burst of anger that somebody might commit, whether it's in a car with road rage, whether it's a punch, no matter what it is, like you said moments ago, if for that one moment somebody would have intervened, if for that one moment some other thought would have occurred, a lot of this horror could be stopped. And it's very strange. So like you're saying, I happen to be a huge proponent of the Constitution and the Second Amendment. Me too. But on the other hand, I do understand that we also have to do something about this. Right. So, boy, is that a problem. And we can sit around here and throw rocks at each other, better than shooting, but that's not the battle we can fight. But I think some of us do live in glass houses. And we will just beat each other and over and over with this ridiculous argument. But we do have to resolve whatever that is, to try to minimize this down to as little as possible. And like I said, starting with Columbine, we have been numbed out by this. And so the big question is what to do. Right. And that's a tough one. And I think this is where our collective consciousness, we can utilize the creativity that we always have access to come up with a solution that may be different and more compassionate than in all these different areas that we've touched on. So, Leslie, thank you so much for joining Tom and I, Leslie Neale. Now, are you working on another film right now? I am working on another film right now, but I'd love to talk about it when I finish it. Okay. Yeah. So you and I will be in touch, and we will talk about this next film. For those of you that want to check out Leslie's other films, you can go to chancefilmsinc.com or the one we've been talking about today, unlikelyfriendsforgive.com, and let's see what radical forgiveness can really do. And Tom Spence, thanks for chiming in with your 2 cents. I always love it. Thank you for inviting me on the show. Yeah, it was great talking to you both. Really stimulating. So I'm going to end with one more quote by Maya Angelou. And she said, during bad circumstances, which is the human inheritance, you must decide not to be reduced. You have your humanity, and you must not allow anything to reduce that. We are obliged to know we are global citizens. Disasters remind us we are world citizens, whether we like it or not. So you've been listening to Living Your Inspired Life. I'm going to say, and so it is, namaste.